When his stepmother kicked him out on his 18th birthday, she told him all he had left from his father was a worthless lumber barn in the middle of nowhere. What he found inside would change not just his future, but the entire story of his past. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, or that the world had already decided who you were, hit that subscribe button. This is a place for stories like ours. The last box slid into the passenger seat of my rust-pocked sedan with a dull thud. It was a small box, filled with the few things that were unequivocally mine. A handful of dog-eared paperbacks, a framed photo of me and my dad on a fishing trip, and a shoebox of chargers and mismatched socks. Everything else I owned was in 2 trash bags in the back. 18 years of life condensed into a small cardboard box and a couple of plastic sacks. Sharon stood on the porch, arms crossed, her face a perfect mask of impatient indifference. The morning was cool, but her posture was ice. She'd been my stepmother for 10 years and my legal guardian for the last 2, ever since Dad died. In all that time, I don't think I'd ever seen her look at me with anything other than mild irritation, as if I were a piece of furniture that was always slightly out of place. "Got everything?" she asked. Her voice was flat, the question of formality, not an offer of help. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I just wanted to be gone. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of birds that were oblivious to the quiet demolition of my life. "The lawyer sent the final papers," she said, finally breaking the quiet. "The deed transfer for that place. It's all yours now, as of midnight." She said the word place like it was something she'd scraped off her shoe. I knew what she was talking about. A week ago, an envelope had arrived from the estate attorney. Inside was a single, crisp document detailing the sole asset left to me in my father's will. A piece of property in a town I'd never heard of, 300 miles north. The property consisted of 40 acres of undeveloped land and 1 structure, listed as a commercial storage barn, formerly Miller's Lumber and Timber. Sharon had laughed when I'd shown it to her. A hollow, sharp sound. "A lumber barn," she'd scoffed, shaking her head. "Classic David. Even his ghost is a financial disappointment. It's probably a pile of rotten wood, Leo. Worth less than the property taxes you'll owe on it." She'd already informed me that my continued residence in her house, my father's house, was contingent on my contributing to the mortgage, a sum I couldn't possibly pay. My 18th birthday wasn't a celebration. It was an eviction notice. "There's an envelope on the kitchen counter," she continued, gesturing with her chin toward the house. "Keys, a map your father drew. Don't want you getting lost and coming back." The cruelty was so casual, so practiced. It was the final twist of the knife. I walked back inside, the screen door slapping shut behind me. The house already felt alien. The photos of my dad had been replaced with her abstract art. His favorite armchair was gone, a sleek, uncomfortable-looking leather thing in its place. It had happened so gradually over the past 2 years that I'd barely noticed, but now, on my way out, the erasure was complete. The envelope was there, a plain white business envelope with my name scrawled on it in my dad's familiar, messy handwriting. My heart seized for a second. He had prepared this. Years ago, he had known this day would come, and he had prepared this for me. I clutched it in my hand, the paper crinkling under the pressure. Inside, I could feel the hard, jagged shape of a key. I didn't open it. Not there. Not with her watching. I turned and walked back out, past her, down the steps, and got into the driver's seat of my car. The engine turned over with a groan, a protest against the long journey ahead. I didn't look back at her as I pulled out of the driveway. I watched the house shrink in my rearview mirror, the house where I'd grown up, where every corner held a memory of my father. It wasn't my home anymore. It was just a building on a street. I had no home. I had a key, a hand-drawn map, and the deed to a worthless lumber barn. The first 50 miles were a blur of suburban sprawl and familiar highways. My mind was a static hum of anger and grief. Anger at Sharon for her coldness, for systematically erasing my father and then me. Grief for the man who had left me with so little, a man I loved, but had, in the end, seen as a failure. My dad, David, was a gentle soul who always seemed to be swimming against the current. He ran a small, independent logistics company, a one-man operation that always seemed to be on the brink of collapse. He was constantly stressed, taking hushed phone calls at all hours, his face etched with worry. Sharon, a successful real estate agent, had seen him as a project, I think, someone to fix. But he was unfixable. The business finally went under a year before he had the heart attack. Sharon had called it a mercy. She said it freed him from the stress that killed him. I'd always carried a quiet shame about it, about him. My friends' fathers were engineers, doctors, managers. My dad was the guy with the failing business and the permanent look of exhaustion. The inheritance, this dilapidated barn, felt like the final punchline to a long, sad joke. His legacy wasn't a college fund or a stable home. It was a pile of rotting wood. As the city gave way to farmland, and farmland to dense, rolling forests, my anger began to cool, replaced by a profound and heavy loneliness. The car was my entire world now, a rattling metal shell, hurtling through a landscape I didn't know, toward a future I couldn't imagine. I pulled over at a rest stop, the air thick with the smell of pine and diesel. I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key, its teeth worn smooth with age. And the map. It wasn't a printed map, but a page torn from a notepad, drawn in my dad's hand. He'd sketched the main highways, then the turnoff onto a state route, and finally, a series of winding country roads. There were little notes in the margins. Gas station here, last one for 50 miles. Watch for deer on this stretch. And next to the final destination, a small, hand-drawn star, he'd written, "The safe place. Be careful, Leo. Trust your gut." The safe place. The words felt strange. A worthless barn was a safe place. It didn't make any sense. But holding the map, seeing his handwriting, it was like a part of him was there in the car with me. A whisper from the past. I traced the lines with my finger, a fragile connection to a man I was realizing I might not have known at all. The rest of the drive took another 4 hours. The roads grew narrower, the trees thicker. My cell service flickered and died. I passed through a town called Northwood, which consisted of little more than a post office, a general store, and a diner with a buzzing neon sign. Following the map, I turned onto a gravel road marked with a faded wooden sign that read, Black Creek Run. The gravel crunched under my tires, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet of the woods. Another mile, and then I saw it. The driveway was almost completely overgrown, 2 faint tracks disappearing into a wall of weeds and saplings. I had to get out of the car to pull aside a thick, thorny bush just to be able to turn in. The car scraped against branches as I eased it down the path. And then the trees opened up, and I was in a large, unkempt clearing. In the center of it stood the barn. Barn was an understatement. It was a monolith, a colossal, hulking structure of weathered gray wood, its metal roof oxidized to a mottled patchwork of rust and silver. It was easily 200 feet long and 3 stories tall at its peak. It wasn't rotting, not like Sharon had predicted. It was sleeping. It looked solid, ancient, and utterly abandoned. Weeds grew thick around its foundation. A few windows high up were broken, dark eyes staring out from the facade. The main doors were a pair of massive sliders, big enough to drive a logging truck through, held shut by a thick, rusted chain and a heavy-duty padlock. My heart sank. This wasn't a safe place. It was a tomb. I got out of the car, and the sheer scale of it was intimidating. The air was still and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. I walked the perimeter. The wood siding was thick, heavy planked stuff, silvered by years of sun and snow. It was weathered, but not rotten. This thing was built to last. I came back to the main doors and looked at the padlock. It was a modern, high-security lock, completely out of place with the rest of the building's aged hardware. The key from the envelope was an old skeleton key. It wouldn't work here. Of course, another dead end. Another one of my father's half-finished, poorly planned ideas. I kicked at a loose stone in frustration, sending it skittering across the gravel. I was alone, miles from anywhere, with a building I couldn't even get into. I was about to give up, to just sleep in my car and figure out what to do in the morning, when I remembered my dad's note. Trust your gut. My gut was telling me this was all a huge mistake. But what if he meant something else? I looked at the massive doors again. Maybe they weren't the only way in. I started walking the perimeter again, more slowly this time, running my hand along the rough wooden siding. Around the back, tucked away behind a thicket of overgrown lilac bushes, I found it. A normal-sized door, what must have been an office or personnel entrance. It was made of solid wood, with a small, grimy window set into the top, and it had an old, iron lock plate, the kind that would fit an old iron key. My breath caught in my throat. I slid the key from my pocket. My hand was shaking as I pushed it into the lock. It resisted for a second, then slid home with a satisfying clunk. I turned it. The mechanism inside groaned, a sound of metal grinding against years of rust and disuse, and then, with a loud click, the bolt retracted. I pushed the door. It scraped against the floor, but it opened. I was in. The air that rushed out to meet me was thick and stale, carrying the scent of sawdust, oil, and something else. Something like time itself. It was pitch black inside. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut a nervous, trembling path through the darkness, illuminating a small, cramped office. It was a disaster. Papers were scattered across a dusty metal desk. A calendar on the wall was turned to July 2016, the month before my dad died. An office chair was overturned, and a filing cabinet stood with one drawer hanging open, empty. It looked like it had been ransacked. My hope, which had been a tiny, flickering flame, sputtered and died. Someone had been here. Whatever my dad had left, if he'd left anything, was probably long gone. I stepped further into the room, my light playing over the mess. Then I saw the footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. There were two sets. One set was large, from a heavy work boot. The other was smaller, more like a sneaker. But what was strange was that they led from the door, around the office, and then they just stopped. In the middle of the room. There were no tracks leading back out. I swept my light across the floor again, my heart starting to pound. That's when I saw it. A dark, rectangular outline on the dusty wooden floorboards, right where the footprints ended. A trap door. My hands were shaking again, but this time with adrenaline, not despair. I knelt down, hooking my fingers under a small, recessed metal ring. I pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted, revealing a dark, square hole and a steep set of wooden stairs leading down into blackness. The air that rose from the opening was different, cooler, drier. I hesitated for only a second. I had nothing to lose. I pointed my phone's light down the stairs and started to descend. The stairs creaked under my weight, but they felt solid. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, concrete-walled cellar. It was completely empty, except for one thing. Sitting directly in the center of the floor was a large, olive-drab metal footlocker, the kind the military uses. It was closed with two heavy latches. There was no lock. My breath hitched. This was it. This was what the ransackers had missed. They'd tossed the office, but they never found the cellar. I knelt before the footlocker, my reflection a distorted ghost in the dusty metal. With trembling fingers, I flipped the latches. They sprang open with a sharp, metallic snap. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was money, stacks of it. Bundles of $100 bills, neatly wrapped in paper bands. More money than I had ever seen in my life. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I reached in and touched one of the stacks. It was real. Underneath the money were a few other items. A small, leather-bound journal, a stack of photographs tied with a string, and on top of it all, a thick, sealed manila envelope. On the front, in my dad's familiar scrawl, was a single word: Leo. My hands were numb as I picked it up. This was the real letter, the real inheritance. The map and key were just the first step of a puzzle. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, the footlocker open in front of me, and I tore open the seal. The letter was long, many pages, all covered in his dense handwriting. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means two things. First, that I am gone. And second, that you made it. You found the safe place. I am so sorry, son. I am sorry for everything. I know you must have so many questions. I know you probably think of me as a failure. A man who couldn't keep his business afloat, who couldn't provide for his family, who left you with nothing but a pile of old wood. I need you to know that almost everything you thought you knew about my life, about my work, was a lie. A lie I constructed, piece by piece, to protect you. I had to stop reading. My eyes were burning. I took a deep, shuddering breath and continued. The letter went on to tell a story that felt like it belonged in a movie, not in my life. My dad's logistics company hadn't been a failure. In the beginning, it had been a legitimate, if struggling, small business. But about a year after he married Sharon, he took on a new client, a big contract that promised to solve all his financial problems. The client was a front for an organized crime syndicate. They used his trucks to move illicit goods, and they paid him handsomely, but they also trapped him. He was laundering money for them, caught in a web he couldn't escape. They were dangerous, Leo, he wrote. Not just thugs. These were smart, ruthless people. Once you were in, you were never out. I saw what they did to people who tried to leave. I couldn't go to the police. They had people on the inside. My only thought, every single day, was how to get you clear. How to build a lifeboat for you before the whole ship went down. The barn was the lifeboat. He had started secretly siphoning off money, small amounts at first, and buying up untraceable assets. Gold coins, bearer bonds, and cash. He bought the barn under a shell corporation, a derelict property no one would ever look at twice. He spent weekends up here, alone, fortifying it. The concrete cellar, the hidden door, reinforcing the walls. He was building a fortress. A place to hide the money, and a place for me to run to if things ever went bad. The business failure was deliberate, he explained. I had to crash it. I had to look like a bankrupt loser so they would write me off, so they wouldn't come looking for any hidden assets after I was gone. It was the only way I could scrub their stain off of our lives. It broke my heart that you had to see me like that you had to live with the shame of it. But I would take your shame over your danger any day of the week. Every single day. He wrote about Sharon. He'd loved her, he said, but he realized too late that her ambition and her connections to the high-end real estate world brought him closer to the very people he was trying to escape. He suspected she knew more than she let on, that she was willfully blind to the source of their improved lifestyle. He couldn't trust her. He couldn't tell her about the barn or the money. It had to be for me, and me alone. There's enough money in this box to start a new life, Leo. A real one. But you have to be smart. You cannot be flashy. You have to disappear for a while. This barn, this land, it's all legally yours, clean and clear. No one knows about this place. Use it, make it your home. There's a man in town, a lawyer named Robert Henderson. He's the only other person on earth who knows a piece of this story. I trusted him to set up the trust that would transfer the deed to you on your 18th. He has another package for you with more instructions. You can trust him. His number is in the journal. Be careful, son. The world is not a kind place, but I have tried to give you a shield. This place is your shield. The last page was stained with what looked like a teardrop. I love you more than words can say. I am so proud of the man you are becoming. Live a good life, Leo. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted. Love, Dad. I finished the letter and the pages fell from my hand. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there in the dark, cold cellar, the beam of my phone light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And then a sob ripped through me, a raw, ragged sound from the deepest part of my soul. I cried for my father, the hero I had mistaken for a failure. I cried for the lonely, terrified man who had spent years building a secret fortress to save me. I cried for the years I had spent being ashamed of him. I cried for the little boy in the photograph who didn't know his dad was a quiet, desperate king defending his tiny kingdom. The weight of his sacrifice, the sheer, crushing weight of his love, settled over me. It wasn't just money in that box. It was his life, his fear, his hope. It was my future, bought and paid for by his quiet, invisible war. I sat there for hours, I think. The world outside, Sharon, my old life, it all felt a million miles away. It was just me and the ghost of my father in a concrete room, surrounded by the silence of the forest. And for the first time since he died, I didn't feel alone. I felt protected. Listen, if you've made it this far into my story, thank you. This was the moment for me, the pivot point on which my entire life turned. Everything I thought was true was stripped away, and I was left with a new, terrifying, and profound reality. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where a single discovery rewrote your entire past and forced you to completely reevaluate your future. It's a lonely place to be, and it's easy to feel like you're the only one who has ever gone through it. I want you to know you're not. If this is hitting a nerve for you, if you're remembering a moment that changed everything, I want to hear about it in the comments. We build community by sharing the stories that shaped us, especially the hard ones. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to what happened next. After the tears, a cold, hard clarity set in. My father had given me a mission. He had given me a shield, and now I had to learn how to use it. My grief was still there, a heavy ache in my chest, but now it was mingled with something else. Purpose. I spent the night in my car, parked just inside the barn's main doors, which I'd managed to pry open from the inside. The footlocker was on the seat beside me. I didn't sleep. I just watched the slivers of moonlight that cut through the gaps in the barn walls, thinking. My father wasn't a failure. He was a strategist. He was a warrior. And Sharon wasn't just cruel. She was a loose end, a potential threat. Did she know about his old associates? Did she have any idea what he'd been involved in? He'd written that he suspected she was willfully blind. That felt right. She only saw what she wanted to see: money, status, and the inconvenience of a stepson who reminded her of a husband she'd deemed a failure. The next morning, as the sun rose and filled the cavernous barn with dusty golden light, I made my choice. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to take the money and disappear. This place, this monument to my father's love, was my home now. I was going to stay. I was going to honor his sacrifice by building a life here on the foundation he had laid for me. My first step was to call the lawyer. I found the leather journal. Inside, on the first page, was a name and number: Robert Henderson, attorney at law. I drove the 20 minutes back into Northwood until I got a bar of service. I parked in front of the diner and dialed the number. My heart was hammering. An older man's voice, calm and steady, answered on the second ring. Henderson? Hello? I stammered. My name is Leo Miller. My father was David Miller. He left your name for me. There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it wasn't a pause of confusion. It was a pause of recognition. Leo, the voice said, and there was a warmth in it that took me by surprise. I've been expecting your call. Your father said you'd call when you were ready. Welcome to Northwood, son. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. I wasn't alone in this. Can you come by my office? It's on Main Street, right above the bakery. An hour later, I was sitting in a worn leather chair across from Robert Henderson. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a full head of white hair. His office was cluttered with books and files, smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. It felt safe. He slid a thick envelope across the desk toward me. Your father left this with me 2 years ago, he said gently. He made me promise not to give it to you until you called me yourself from up here. He wanted to be sure you'd found the place on your own. I opened it. Inside were documents. The original deed to the property, free and clear. The articles of incorporation for the shell company he'd used to buy it, now legally transferred to me. There were also bank statements for a small, local account he'd set up in my name with a starting balance of $10,000. Clean money, he explained, for immediate expenses. And there was another, shorter letter. This one was more practical. It detailed the barn's features, the well for fresh water, the location of the septic system, the backup generator he'd installed in a hidden shed. It gave me advice on how to slowly and carefully move the cash into legitimate accounts over time without raising red flags. It was a complete survival guide. Your father was a very meticulous man, Henderson said, watching my face as I read. And a very brave one. He came to me a few years back, told me a sanitized version of his story. Enough for me to know he was in trouble and that his priority was protecting his son. Everything we did was by the book, legally sound. This property, this money, it's yours. No one can touch it. He leaned forward. His instructions to me were simple. Help you with the legalities, but otherwise, stay out of your way unless you ask for help. He wanted you to build your own life, not live out a plan he made. We talked for another hour. He told me about the town, about the people. He gave me the name of a reliable contractor, a plumber, an electrician. He treated me not like a kid, but like a man with serious business to attend to. As I was leaving, he put a hand on my shoulder. Your father loved you very much, Leo. Everything he did for you. Don't ever forget that. I walked out of his office into the bright afternoon sun, feeling like I'd grown a foot taller. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but now it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. This was my legacy. This was my fight. As I drove back to the barn, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from my old town. I answered, my gut tightening. Leo? It's Sharon. Her voice was clipped, businesslike. I just got a notification from the estate. The title transfer on that dump is complete. I've been talking to a developer who is very interested in that whole parcel. They're consolidating land for a resort project. They're willing to offer you $50,000 for it, as is. It's more than it's worth, frankly, but it's a quick, clean sale. I can handle the paperwork. We'll split my commission. The casual greed of it. the assumption that I was still the lost little boy she could push around. It lit a fire in me. 50,000. For a place that held my entire future, my father's entire legacy. I thought about the stacks of cash in the footlocker. I could hear the faint, patronizing tone in her voice. She thought she was throwing a bone to the pathetic orphan. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it felt like a cannon shot. There was a surprised silence on the other end. "What do you mean, no? Leo, don't be an idiot. It's a falling down barn. This is found money. It's the only smart move." "It's not for sale," I said, my voice stronger now. "It's my home." I could almost hear her scoff. "Your home? Don't be so dramatic. You won't last a week out there. Take the deal." "No," I said again. "And Sharon, don't call me again." I hung up the phone before she could respond. My hand was trembling, but I was smiling. It was the first time I had ever stood up to her. It was the first time I had ever truly felt in control of my own life. I pulled back into the overgrown driveway and killed the engine. I looked at the great, silent barn. It wasn't a dump. It wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary. It was my inheritance. And the real work was just beginning. The first few weeks were a blur of hard physical labor. My days started at sunrise and ended long after sunset, my body aching with a satisfying exhaustion I'd never known before. The barn, once a symbol of my father's failure, became my entire world, a project that consumed every ounce of my energy and focus. I started with the basics. With Henderson's help, I got the power turned back on and had the well and septic systems inspected. They were sound. My dad had built this place to be self-sufficient. I found the generator he'd written about in a small, camouflaged shed behind the barn. It was fully fueled and ready to go. My first major purchase was a heavy-duty truck from a used car lot in a town over. It felt like a betrayal of my trusty old sedan, but I needed something that could haul lumber and supplies. I spent my days clearing brush, patching the few leaks in the roof, and replacing the broken windows. I hired the contractor Henderson recommended, a quiet, capable man named Gus, to help me frame out a small living space inside one corner of the massive structure. We built a small apartment right on the main floor, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a combined kitchen and living area. It was small, maybe 600 square feet, but inside the vastness of the barn, it felt like a cozy, fortified cabin. The rest of the barn I left as it was, a cavernous space filled with shadows and memories. I cleaned the old office, leaving my dad's desk and chair exactly where they were. It became a sort of shrine. Sometimes I'd just sit in there, running my hand over the worn wood of the desk, feeling the presence of the man who had poured his love and fear into these walls. I learned to live with the secret. The footlocker was moved from the cellar to a hidden compartment Gus helped me build under the floor of my new bedroom. Knowing it was there was both a comfort and a constant, low-grade source of anxiety. It wasn't just money. It was evidence. It was a dangerous secret that I had to protect. I was careful. I paid for everything in cash, using the clean money from the bank account my dad had set up. I lived simply. The people in Northwood were reserved but friendly. They were used to people who kept to themselves. To them, I was just some kid who'd inherited his family's old property and was fixing it up. They asked no questions. I bought my groceries at the general store, got my coffee at the diner, and bought tools and lumber from the local hardware supply. In these small, mundane interactions, I began to feel the first fragile threads of community. The owner of the diner, a woman named Sarah, started saving me a corner booth. The guy at the hardware store, a young man my age named Ben, would give me tips on whatever project I was working on. It was a quiet, unassuming belonging that was entirely new to me. One evening, about 2 months after I'd arrived, Gus and I were finishing up the last of the interior walls. He was packing up his tools when he paused and looked around the vast, shadowy space of the main barn. "You know," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the immense quiet, "your dad hired me to do some work out here a few years back. Helped him pour that cellar floor. Never told me what it was for. Just said he wanted a dry, secure place for storage." I froze, my hammer in my hand. "You knew my dad?" "Not well," Gus said, wiping his hands on a rag. "He was a quiet man, intense. Seemed like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he was always fair with me. Paid on time, in cash." He looked at me, a knowing, gentle look in his eyes. "He talked about you, though. Said he was building this place for his son's future. Said he wanted you to have a place where no one could ever corner you. Whatever he was running from, he was determined it wouldn't get to you." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of gruff comfort. "He'd be proud of what you're doing here, kid." When he left, I stood alone in the middle of the barn, the smell of fresh-cut pine in the air. His words were a gift. My father wasn't just a ghost in the letter anymore. He was a man remembered by others. A man who had told a near stranger that he was building a future for his son. The fortress wasn't just in the concrete and wood. It was in the foresight, the planning, the quiet conversations with a local contractor. It was all part of the shield he'd been building around me. That night, I didn't feel the hum of anxiety. I felt a deep, abiding peace. I was home. I was safe. I was the keeper of my father's legacy, and I was finally starting to understand what that meant. It wasn't about hiding, it was about building. A year passed, then another. The sharp edges of my grief began to soften, worn smooth by the rhythm of seasons and the routine of hard work. The barn became less of a fortress and more of a home. I planted a garden, cleared a larger section of the land, and cut walking trails through the woods. The 40 acres that had seemed so daunting at first became my sanctuary. I learned the names of the trees, the patterns of the deer that came to drink from the creek at dawn. The silence of the forest, once oppressive, was now a comforting blanket. I had kept my life small and quiet, just as my father had advised. But you can't hide from the world forever. The world eventually comes looking for you. It came in the form of a sleek black SUV that rolled down my driveway one crisp autumn afternoon. I was splitting firewood, and the sound of the engine was an intrusion, a violation of the peace I had so carefully cultivated. A man in a tailored suit got out. He was slick and polished, a creature from another world, the world I had left behind. He introduced himself as a representative for a large development corporation. It was the same one Sharon had mentioned on the phone 2 years ago. "Mr. Miller," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We've been trying to reach you. We're acquiring all the land along Black Creek Run for a luxury golf resort and residential community. We've already secured the adjacent properties. Yours is the last piece of the puzzle." He pulled a sleek tablet from his briefcase and showed me a digital rendering of the project. Pristine fairways and sprawling mansions superimposed over the woods I now called home. My barn was a conspicuous blank spot in the middle of their perfect, manicured world. "We are prepared to make you a very generous offer," he said, naming a figure that was 10 times what Sharon had quoted me. It was a life-changing amount of money. Enough to go anywhere, do anything. 2 years ago, I would have jumped at it. But as I stood there, smelling the wood smoke on the air, looking at the solid, weathered face of my barn, I felt nothing but a cold, hard knot of defiance in my stomach. "I'm not interested," I said. The man's smile tightened. "Perhaps you misunderstand. This is a significant offer, a fresh start. A young man like you. You could do a lot with this kind of money." "I already have a fresh start," I told him, my voice even. "Right here. The property is not for sale." He sighed, the mask of civility slipping. "Mr. Miller, This project is happening, with or without you. We can make this easy, or we can make it difficult. We have lawyers. We can explore eminent domain, zoning violations. We can keep you tied up in court for years. Eventually, we will get this land. The easy way just puts more money in your pocket. It was a threat, delivered with a polite smile. I saw in his eyes the same ruthless logic my father had described in his letters. These were the kind of people who saw the world as a collection of assets to be acquired, who saw my home as a blank spot on a map. I thought of my father, building this place in secret, trying to create one small corner of the world where his son couldn't be cornered. And here was this man in his expensive suit, trying to do just that. I have a lawyer too, I said, looking him straight in the eye. His name is Robert Henderson. You can send any further correspondence to him. Now, you're on private property. I'd like you to leave. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. He had expected an easy mark, a naive kid he could bully or buy. He wasn't prepared for resistance. He gave a curt nod, got back in his SUV, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the quiet air. My hands were shaking. The peace of my sanctuary had been shattered. The war my father had been fighting wasn't over. It had just been passed down to me. I immediately went inside and called Henderson. I explained what had happened. He listened patiently. I was afraid this might happen, he said when I was finished. This development company is aggressive. But your father was smart, Leo. The way he set up the trust and the corporation that owns this land, it's an iron box. They can try to bully you, but they will have a very hard time breaking it legally. But this will be a fight. Are you ready for it? I looked around the small apartment I had built with my own hands. I saw the framed photo of me and my dad on the wall. I thought of his last letter, of the shield he had tried to give me. I'm ready, I said. Good, Henderson replied, because your father left one last thing with me for this exact situation. He called it the insurance policy. The fight for the barn, for my home, had begun. It was a long and grueling process. The developers were relentless. They sent surveyors who tried to trespass on my land. They filed frivolous legal challenges against my zoning permits. They tried to claim the property was environmentally hazardous. It was a war of attrition, designed to wear me down, to bleed me dry emotionally and financially. But I wasn't alone. Henderson was a brilliant, tenacious lawyer who seemed to relish the fight. And the insurance policy my dad had left was a masterstroke. It was a thick file of documents, records of my dad's transactions with his former criminal associates. Names, dates, bank transfers. It wasn't enough to convict them of anything major, but it was more than enough to trigger a massive federal investigation into their legitimate businesses. Businesses that, Henderson discovered, were major investors in this very development project. We never had to use it. The threat was enough. Henderson arranged a meeting with the developer's legal team. He laid out our position. We were not selling. We were prepared to fight them in court for a decade if we had to. And then, he subtly alluded to the existence of certain documents concerning some of their key financial backers. He suggested that a long, public court battle might bring unwanted attention to their investors' other business dealings. It was a high-stakes bluff, but it worked. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter stating that the company was withdrawing its offer and would be redesigning their project to build around my 40-acre parcel. I had won. I had held the line. I had protected the safe place. That evening, I walked out to the edge of my property, where the woods met the newly cleared land of the developers. I could hear the distant sound of their machinery, but it sounded different now. It was the sound of a beast that had been tamed, forced to walk around the territory I had claimed as my own. I had faced the modern version of the monsters my father had run from. Not gangsters, but faceless corporations with the same ruthless hunger. And I hadn't backed down. I finally understood the last part of his legacy. The barn wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to stand your ground. So that's how I found my home. Not in a house, but in a dusty old barn full of secrets and memories. It's been 5 years now since I drove down that overgrown lane. The developers built their resort, a world of green lawns and tennis courts that stops abruptly at my tree line. My world is one of dirt, wood smoke, and quiet purpose. I've started a small business of my own, a custom woodworking shop I run out of the main part of the barn, using reclaimed lumber from the area. It's a quiet life, a good life. If my story taught me anything, it's that inheritance isn't about what you're given, it's about what you choose to do with it. My father left me money, yes, but that was the least of it. He left me a second chance. He left me a story that made sense of my past and gave me a map for my future. He taught me that the things people dismiss as worthless, a failing business, a forgotten old barn, can sometimes hold the most value. They can be shields, they can be sanctuaries, they can be home. What did this story teach you? I really want to know. The most powerful lessons are the ones we share. If you have a story about finding value where no one else saw it, or about a time you had to stand your ground to protect something that mattered, please share it in the comments below. Let's make this channel a community of people who know how to look deeper, who understand that the richest legacies are the ones built on love and sacrifice, not just money. Thank you for listening to my story. And don't forget to subscribe, because we all have more stories to tell, and we all deserve a safe place to tell them.